It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon, a simple day out in the park with her niece, nothing more. They had just sat down on a bench, laughing over the silly things her niece found amusing, when she noticed him, a police officer, tall and broad-shouldered, watching her from across the park with a gaze that burned with something unmistakably hostile. He didn't approach right away, he stood there, assessing her, eyes narrowing each time he saw her smile. He was waiting, letting his assumptions build a story around her that couldn't have been further from the truth. Without warning, he crossed the distance between them in a few long strides, standing too close, his towering figure casting an imposing shadow over her and the child. His stare was cold and unyielding, but it was more than that, there was an anger in his gaze, an assumption of guilt, as if her mere presence there was an offense in itself. He glanced at her niece and sneered before addressing her, making no effort to hide the disdain lacing his words. "Is there a reason you're here, disturbing the peace?" His voice was filled with an arrogance that oozed disdain, each word carrying a weight designed to crush, to assert his authority in the most humiliating way possible. "Maybe you should be somewhere else, somewhere you actually belong." She looked up at him, unwavering, but inside, her anger simmered. The playground was open to everyone, a place for kids to be kids, a place where people could find a moment of peace in the city's noise. But for him, her being there with her niece was enough reason to assume trouble. He was making it clear that he didn't think she belonged, that she wasn't welcome in a place where she was doing nothing more than enjoying time with her family. She spoke calmly, trying to avoid further conflict. "I'm here with my niece. We're just spending the afternoon together. Is that a problem?" He scoffed, folding his arms and shaking his head as if the very idea of her being there was an insult. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he challenged, his eyes flashing with a cruel amusement. "You people always think you're above the law. I know how this goes." His words hung in the air, heavy and bitter, a slap that carried years of prejudice, a prejudice he wore like a badge of honor. "This park isn't for you," he added, his voice low and menacing, as if daring her to resist, daring her to fight back. Her niece tugged at her sleeve, looking up at her with wide, frightened eyes, clearly sensing the tension, feeling the weight of the officer's harsh words without understanding why he was so angry. The officer's attention flicked to the child, his expression twisting with a sneer. "What are you teaching her?" he asked mockingly. "To disrespect the law like you?" She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around her niece's hand, grounding herself as the anger surged inside her. But she knew she couldn't let it show. She knew what he wanted, to provoke, to dominate, to reduce her to the stereotypes he was so eager to believe. "I'm teaching her that we all have a right to be here," she replied, her voice measured but firm. "To be treated with respect, no matter who we are." He let out a harsh laugh, crossing his arms. "Respect? You think you deserve respect?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper, his hand twitching by his side as if he was itching for an excuse to act. "Respect is earned, not given. Especially for people like you." Her blood ran cold, the insult biting into her skin, her patience wearing thin as he made his intentions clear. But what he didn't know was that she wasn't just another bystander, not someone he could intimidate and humiliate without consequence. Beneath her calm exterior, she carried a title, a badge that gave her more authority than he could imagine, and she knew how to wield it. But she stayed silent, her eyes steady, refusing to give him the reaction he craved. The officer's frustration grew, his face reddening as he took a step closer, his voice dropping even further. "What's the matter?" he sneered. "Got nothing to say now? Maybe you're finally realizing that you're out of place. That you're out of your league." She held her ground, her heart pounding but her expression calm. Inside, her mind raced through every possibility, every way she could turn the situation around, but she was waiting, watching him dig his own grave deeper with every word, every insult. Then, he crossed the line. Without warning, his hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a grip that was both painful and filled with his unspoken threat. "Maybe a night in a cell will remind you of your place," he spat, pulling her toward him, clearly intending to arrest her without any grounds, to make an example out of her for daring to stand up to him. But that was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment she knew would come the second he let his mask slip, the second he overstepped his authority. She felt a surge of energy, a steely resolve solidifying within her as she finally allowed herself to meet his gaze with an intensity that made him hesitate, a flicker of doubt flashing across his face. "What's wrong?" she asked softly, her voice laced with a confidence he hadn't expected. "Do you really think you can treat people like this? Abuse your power just because you think no one will stand up to you?" For the first time, the officer seemed taken aback, his grip loosening slightly as he looked at her, his arrogance faltering. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down, he doubled down, tightening his grip and sneering. "I can do whatever I want. I'm the law here." She met his gaze, unblinking, the faintest hint of a smirk curving her lips as she whispered, "No, you're not. And you're about to find out just how wrong you are." In that split second, she made her move, a calculated, swift response that left him stunned, his power crumbling as the realization dawned on him that he'd severely miscalculated. But the confrontation was far from over, and as she took control, she knew that this was only the beginning. Because the officer was about to learn, in the most shocking way possible, that the woman he had tried to humiliate, to intimidate, was no ordinary civilian. And as he faced the consequences of his own arrogance, the question lingered, would he be able to escape the trap he had set for himself, or would he be forced to confront a reckoning unlike anything he'd ever imagined? Stay with us to find out what happens next, as this story of courage, justice, and retribution unfolds in a way that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power and respect. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in equality, respect, and the power of standing up for what's right. This story is for everyone who's ever faced prejudice and had the courage to rise above it. We hope it resonates with you and serves as a reminder that justice always has a way of finding its path. Enjoy the story, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel to join a community committed to impactful narratives. Enjoy the story. The park was a quiet retreat in the heart of the city, an urban escape that offered a slice of nature to anyone seeking it. The benches were painted a deep green, blending with the surrounding trees that lined the playground. A fountain bubbled in the center, where families gathered to watch the water dance in the sun, children running in circles, voices filling the air with laughter. It was here, on an unassuming Wednesday afternoon, that Jessica found herself, hoping for a peaceful day away from the endless responsibilities her life demanded. She held the hand of her niece, Chloe, who was a bundle of energy, her eyes wide with excitement as she looked around at the playground. Jessica was a young black woman with a calm yet determined presence, a quality that served her well in her line of work. Beneath her gentle smile and warm demeanor was a woman who had seen more of the world's unfairness than she'd cared to. As an FBI agent, Jessica had made it her mission to bring justice to those who couldn't find it themselves. She had learned to be patient, to listen, to act when it mattered most. But here, on this sunny day in the park, she was just Aunt Jessica, ready to push Chloe on the swings and savor the little things that felt so rare. Chloe tugged at her hand, eyes shining with excitement. "Aunt Jess, can I go on the slides?" she asked, barely able to contain herself. Jessica laughed, squeezing her hand. "Go ahead, Chloe. I'll be right here watching you." As she released her niece, Jessica's gaze followed the little girl as she ran off, her laughter filling the air as she joined a group of other kids. Jessica took a seat on a nearby bench, allowing herself to relax, soaking in the joyful sounds around her. In moments like these, it was easy to forget the intensity of her work, the weight she carried. She felt a sense of calm wash over her, something she rarely felt in her line of duty. But that calm was short-lived. Across the park, there was a man who seemed out of place among the playful families and children. Officer Frank Wallace, a local policeman with a hardened expression and an intimidating build, was known for his strict, often abrasive demeanor. His career was marked by a questionable reputation, whispered accusations of aggressive behavior and prejudice that trailed him wherever he went. Frank was a man who believed in a rigid set of rules, his own. He carried himself with an air of superiority, often crossing lines in his interactions, especially with people he considered beneath him. And right now, his eyes were locked on Jessica. He watched her from a distance, eyes narrowing as he studied her with an intensity that was far from friendly. To him, Jessica didn't belong here. It was an unspoken judgment he felt justified in making. His years on the force had fueled a deep-seated conviction that he had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. As far as he was concerned, a young black woman with a child in this part of town was reason enough for suspicion. Jessica felt his gaze before she saw him. It was a prickle at the back of her neck, the subtle but familiar sensation of being watched. She looked up, her eyes landing on Frank, who stood across the playground, watching her with a stare that was uncomfortably invasive. His uniform caught the sunlight, a stark reminder of the authority he wielded. Jessica recognized the look in his eyes. She had seen it before, in others like him, men who believed their badges granted them an unchecked power, a right to judge without knowing. Jessica forced herself to look away, hoping he would lose interest and go about his business. She didn't want to make a scene, especially not in front of her niece. But Frank had already decided that her presence was an affront, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He started moving toward her, a purpose in his stride that signaled trouble. Jessica's pulse quickened as she prepared herself, feeling the weight of his gaze growing heavier with each step he took. As he approached, Chloe came running back toward her, oblivious to the tension building. She reached out, wrapping her arms around Jessica's leg, her small face looking up with a beaming smile. "Aunt Jess, I went down the big slide," she announced proudly, her excitement a bright contrast to the darkening mood around them. Jessica smiled at her niece, reaching down to ruffle her hair. "I'm so proud of you, Chloe. You're so brave." But before she could say anything more, Frank's shadow loomed over them. He stopped just in front of her, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Jessica with a look that made it clear he saw her as something unwelcome, something he needed to deal with. Jessica straightened, shielding Chloe slightly as she met his gaze, refusing to show any sign of fear. Frank's voice was cold, laced with a barely concealed hostility. "Is there a reason you're here, taking up space?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. He ignored Chloe, his attention fully on Jessica, as if the child didn't even exist. Jessica didn't flinch. "We're here to enjoy the park, officer. Is there a problem with that?" Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness beneath it that hinted at her unwillingness to be intimidated. Frank's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "I don't need attitude from you. This park isn't for loitering. I'd suggest you take your family somewhere else." He glanced pointedly at Chloe, then back to Jessica, his implication clear. Jessica felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she kept it contained, not wanting to escalate the situation in front of Chloe. "We're not loitering. My niece is here to play, just like any other child." She kept her voice even, hoping to avoid provoking him further. But Frank wasn't interested in reason or understanding. He stepped closer, towering over her, his face contorted with an air of disdain. "I don't think you understand who you're talking to. People like you need to learn respect." His words were venomous, and Jessica could feel Chloe's grip on her hand tightening, the child sensing the hostility radiating from the officer. Jessica took a steadying breath, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, all of them telling her to keep calm, to stay collected. But she also knew she couldn't let this slide. Not only for her sake, but for Chloe's. She needed to show her niece that standing up for oneself was important, even when faced with someone who abused their authority. "Respect goes both ways, officer," she said, her voice strong, unwavering. "And right now, you're not showing much of it." Frank's face flushed with anger, a vein pulsing in his forehead as he stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think you're entitled to lecture me? You people are always looking for a reason to be offended, aren't you? Jessica's hand clenched, her patience stretched thin as she held Chloe close, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and frustration. She wanted nothing more than to walk away, to leave this man and his hatred behind, but she knew he wouldn't let them go that easily. Frank's hand twitched by his side, a silent threat as he leaned in closer, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Maybe I should remind you of your place," he said, his eyes flashing with a dangerous intent. "A night in a cell might teach you some manners." Jessica's blood ran cold at the implication, her instincts kicking in, warning her of the danger that was quickly escalating. She held Chloe tightly, shielding her from the brunt of Frank's aggression, her mind racing with options, calculating the best way to defuse the situation without compromising her safety or her niece's. But Frank was relentless, feeding off her discomfort, his smirk widening as he saw the fear in Chloe's eyes, a twisted satisfaction gleaming in his own. To him, this was a game, a chance to assert his authority, to put someone in their place, to reinforce the prejudices he held so tightly. Jessica's patience finally snapped. She straightened, her gaze steely as she met his eyes, refusing to back down, to give him the satisfaction of seeing her submit. She took a step forward, her voice steady, controlled. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice low but powerful, a quiet strength radiating from her words. "And you have no right to treat us like this. We have every right to be here, just as much as anyone else." Frank's smirk faltered for a moment, surprise flickering in his eyes before he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Is that so?" he said, his tone mocking. "Well, let's see if you still feel that way when you're behind bars." Jessica knew the threat was empty, a hollow attempt to intimidate her, to make her doubt herself. But she also knew she couldn't let him win, couldn't let him continue to wield his authority as a weapon against those he deemed unworthy. She stood her ground, her heart pounding as she prepared herself for what she knew was coming. Frank's hand twitched again, a dangerous glint in his eyes as he took another step forward, closing the distance between them. And in that moment, Jessica realized that this was no longer about her, or even about Chloe. This was about something bigger, a fight against a force that had oppressed and silenced for too long, a force that thrived on fear and submission. As the tension reached its peak, Jessica braced herself, her resolve solidifying, a steely determination filling her as she prepared to face whatever came next. She knew this confrontation was far from over, that Frank's wrath would only grow, but she was ready. She was ready to stand her ground, to fight for her dignity, her rights, and the safety of those she loved. Because this time, she wouldn't back down. This time, she would show him just how wrong he was to underestimate her. The silence that followed Jessica's defiant words seemed to hang in the air, thick and almost electric. Chloe clung to her leg, her wide eyes fixed on the officer towering over them, her small hand squeezing tighter with each second that passed. Frank's jaw tightened, a dark, unspoken rage simmering in his eyes as he stared at Jessica, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone he deemed beneath him. For a moment, he looked at a loss for words, as if her refusal to submit had momentarily shattered his sense of control. But it didn't take long for him to recover. Frank leaned in close, his face just inches from Jessica's, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "You think you're something special, don't you? Think you're above the law?" His eyes flicked to Chloe, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Or maybe you're just trying to put on a show for the kid here. Trying to play the hero." Jessica's heart pounded, her anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. But she forced herself to stay calm, to keep her expression composed. Chloe was still watching, her innocent eyes taking in everything, her small body pressed close against her aunt as if trying to disappear from the tension. Jessica knew she had to stay strong, not only for herself but for Chloe. She wouldn't let this man intimidate her, wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "I'm not putting on a show," Jessica replied, her voice steady. "But I'm also not going to let you treat us like this. We have as much right to be here as anyone else." Frank scoffed, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "Rights? People like you are always talking about your rights. He straightened, crossing his arms, his smirk widening. But you don't seem to realize that out here, in my city, I'm the one in charge. Not you. And if I decide you're a problem, then guess what? You're a problem. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine at the cold finality in his voice, the smug certainty that came from years of wielding unchecked power. She had met men like him before, people who thought they could hide their hatred behind a badge, who used their authority to control and intimidate. But she knew better. And she wasn't going to let him walk all over her. Chloe's grip tightened, her small voice barely a whisper. "Aunt Jess, can we go? Please." Jessica glanced down at her niece, feeling a pang of guilt at the fear in her eyes. She wanted nothing more than to scoop her up and leave, to take her somewhere far away from this hostility, from the hatred pouring off this man in waves. But she knew that if she backed down now, if she let Frank win, it would only reinforce the power he thought he had. And she couldn't allow that, not for herself, and certainly not for Chloe. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on Frank's, unflinching. "We're not going anywhere," she said, each word measured, calm, but with a strength that couldn't be mistaken. "You don't intimidate me, officer. And you're not scaring Chloe either." Frank's smirk vanished, his expression darkening as he took a step closer, his voice a low growl. "Is that right? Well, maybe I should show you just what happens to people who think they can disrespect me." Jessica could feel her heart hammering in her chest, but she held her ground, her gaze steady. She could see the twisted satisfaction in his eyes, the thrill he got from exerting his power, from watching her and Chloe squirm. But beneath that satisfaction was something else, a hint of insecurity, a flicker of doubt. And Jessica realized, in that moment, that Frank's power was fragile, that his sense of control was as much an illusion as his authority. She didn't back down. "You don't know who you're dealing with, officer," she said, her voice unwavering. "And maybe it's time you learned." Frank's mouth twisted into a sneer. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," Jessica replied simply, her eyes never leaving his. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You're gonna regret this, lady. I'll make sure of it." With that, he turned and strode away, leaving Jessica and Chloe standing alone. Jessica exhaled, feeling a wave of relief wash over her, though her body was still tense, her mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. She glanced down at Chloe, who was looking up at her with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Are we okay, Aunt Jess?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jessica knelt down, pulling Chloe into a comforting embrace. "We're okay, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking her hair. "You don't need to be scared. I'm here, and I won't let anything happen to you." Chloe nodded, hugging her tightly, and Jessica could feel the small child's heart pounding against her own. She held her close, silently vowing that she would protect Chloe no matter what. She wouldn't let Frank or anyone else make her feel powerless. But as they sat there, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. She knew men like Frank didn't back down easily, that he would likely come back, looking for a reason to exert his control once more. And Jessica was ready for it. She wasn't going to let him win, wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She was prepared to stand her ground, to fight for her rights and her dignity. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly, with Jessica keeping a watchful eye on her surroundings, her senses heightened, her body tense. Chloe eventually returned to the playground, her fear dissipating as she played with the other children, her laughter once again filling the air. But Jessica couldn't relax, couldn't shake the feeling that Frank was somewhere nearby, watching, waiting. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Jessica finally decided it was time to leave. She called Chloe over, gathering their things, and they began the walk back to the car, Jessica's eyes scanning the area, her senses on high alert. And then, as they rounded a corner, she saw him, Frank, leaning against his patrol car, arms crossed, a smug expression on his face as he watched her approach. Jessica felt her pulse quicken, her muscles tensing as she prepared for what was to come. She knew he wasn't here to apologize, wasn't here to back down. This was a game to him, a power play, and he was determined to win. Frank straightened as she neared, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his tone mocking. Jessica forced herself to stay calm, to keep her voice steady. "I thought our conversation was over, officer." "Oh, it's far from over," he replied, taking a step closer, his voice low and threatening. "I told you, you don't get to talk to me like that and walk away." Chloe clung to Jessica's side, her eyes wide with fear, and Jessica felt a surge of anger rise within her, a fierce protectiveness that made her stand taller, her gaze hardening as she met Frank's stare. "You've already made your point," Jessica said firmly, her voice laced with a quiet strength. "And I think it's time for you to leave us alone." Frank laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that grated on her nerves. "You think you can tell me what to do? I don't take orders from people like you." Jessica's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure, refusing to let him see the effect his words had on her. She knew he was trying to get a reaction, to provoke her, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Let's go, Chloe," she said, taking her niece's hand and turning away, hoping to defuse the situation by walking away. But Frank wasn't finished. He reached out, grabbing Jessica's arm, stopping her in her tracks. His grip was firm, almost painful, and Jessica could feel the cold metal of his badge pressing into her skin. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Not until I say so." Jessica felt her anger flare, her patience reaching its limit as she turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a defiance that took him by surprise. "Get your hand off me," she said, each word measured, filled with a quiet fury. For a moment, Frank hesitated, his grip loosening slightly as he met her gaze, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, wouldn't allow him to admit defeat. He tightened his grip, a sneer twisting his lips as he leaned in close. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he murmured, his voice dripping with contempt. "But I can break you, lady. I can make your life a living hell. You don't know who you're messing with." Jessica met his gaze, unblinking, her voice calm but filled with a steely resolve. "Maybe it's you who doesn't know who you're messing with, officer." Frank's expression faltered, his smirk fading as he searched her face, a flicker of doubt finally creeping into his eyes. But before he could react, Jessica pulled her arm free, stepping back, her body tense, ready to defend herself if necessary. She knew this confrontation was far from over, knew that Frank's twisted need for control wouldn't allow him to let this go. But she was ready to face whatever he threw at her, to stand her ground and show him that she wasn't afraid. As she led Chloe away, her heart pounding, her mind racing, Jessica felt a surge of determination filling her, a resolve that burned brighter with each step. She knew that the fight was only just beginning, that Frank would return, and that when he did, she would be waiting, ready to show him just how wrong he was to underestimate her. Because this time, she wasn't backing down. This time, she was going to make sure he paid for every word, every threat, every twisted attempt to break her. And she was going to do it on her terms. The question was, would he be ready for what was coming? The air was thick with tension as Jessica guided Chloe toward their car, her senses alert, her body tense. She could feel Frank's presence lingering in her mind, a dark cloud that had cast a shadow over what should have been a peaceful day. As they walked, Chloe clung to her hand, her small fingers trembling, a reflection of the fear Jessica herself was struggling to suppress. Jessica took a deep breath, forcing herself to project calm, hoping to shield her niece from the ugliness of the day. But as they neared the parking lot, a familiar figure stepped out from the shadows between two cars, Officer Frank Wallace, his arms crossed, a smug smirk twisting his lips. Jessica's heart sank as she realized he wasn't done, that his obsession with asserting control had brought him here, following them like a dark echo of all the injustice she'd fought against. Leaving so soon, he sneered, blocking her path. Chloe instinctively hid behind Jessica, gripping her coat, her wide eyes peeking out as she tried to make herself small. Jessica's voice was steady but laced with steel as she addressed him. "This needs to end, officer. I'm asking you one last time, leave us alone." Frank's eyes glinted with a cruel amusement as he took a step closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're really something, aren't you? Think you can just talk down to me, walk away like you're untouchable?" He shook his head, the smirk growing. "But that's not how this works." Jessica held her ground, her gaze unwavering. "And what exactly do you think you're accomplishing by following us?" Frank scoffed, his face twisting in disdain. "I'm making sure you understand the consequences of disrespecting me." He pointed a finger, barely inches from her face, his voice lowering to a menacing tone. "People like you need to be put in your place." Jessica felt a surge of anger rising, her patience hanging by a thread. She had dealt with hostility, faced those who let power corrupt them, but something about Frank's words, the weight of his prejudice, the satisfaction he took in intimidating her, brought her resolve to a boiling point. She took a steadying breath, keeping her voice low and controlled. "You think this makes you powerful? Harassing a mother with her child? That's how you define your authority?" Frank's smirk wavered for a moment, as though he hadn't expected her to push back. But he quickly masked it, his eyes hardening as he straightened, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't get it, do you? Out here, I am the law. And the sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be." Jessica's gaze didn't falter, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? That no one's watching, that no one will hold you accountable." He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the parking lot. "Accountable? To who? You." He shook his head, chuckling darkly. "I've seen people like you come and go, thinking they can change things, thinking they're above it all. But you're no different from anyone else." Jessica's eyes narrowed, her voice unwavering. "Then maybe it's time someone reminded you what real accountability looks like." For the first time, Frank's bravado faltered, a flicker of confusion flashing across his face. "What are you talking about?" Jessica didn't answer, her silence stretching as she let him stew in his own uncertainty, the smugness slowly draining from his expression as her words sank in. She could see it, the dawning realization, the cracks in his confidence as he began to wonder if he'd miscalculated. Just then, Jessica's phone buzzed in her pocket, a notification from a number she recognized. She glanced at it, her lips curving in a slight smile as she saw the confirmation she'd been waiting for. It was time to let Frank see just how wrong he was. She looked back at him, her voice calm, with a hint of amusement. "You're really certain no one's watching, aren't you? That you can say and do whatever you want without consequences?" Frank's face twisted in confusion, then anger. "Are you trying to threaten me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jessica's smile widened, a glint of steel in her eyes as she took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And I think it's time you knew who you're dealing with too." She pulled a badge from her jacket pocket, holding it up so that the gleam of the FBI insignia caught the light, and watched as Frank's eyes widened, his face draining of color. She could see the shock rippling through him, the way his smug facade crumbled, leaving only the raw fear that lay beneath it. He took a shaky step back, stammering, "You're FBI." Jessica's voice was calm, almost cold as she spoke. "That's right, Officer Wallace. And I've been watching you. I've seen how you operate, the people you intimidate, the power you abuse. And believe me, we've been documenting everything." Frank's face went pale, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, his bravado replaced by a silence filled with fear. Jessica didn't let him off the hook. "You thought you could push me around, just another person you could intimidate, another powerless face in the crowd. Her voice sharpened, each word cutting through the air like a blade. But you chose the wrong person this time. Frank stammered, his voice trembling as he tried to regain his composure. Listen, this is all a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job. Jessica raised an eyebrow, her gaze unyielding. Harassing a mother with her child in a public park. Following us to our car, threatening us. She shook her head slowly. That's not doing your job, officer. That's abuse of power, and it's going on record. Frank's face twisted with desperation, a last-ditch effort to regain control as he spoke. You can't do this, you have no proof. It's your word against mine. Jessica smiled, a quiet confidence in her eyes. Actually, we have plenty of proof. Enough to open a formal investigation. You see, officer, your record isn't as spotless as you might think. There are witnesses, complaints filed, people who've been waiting for a chance to see you held accountable. Frank swallowed hard, the realization dawning that his actions, his years of unchecked power, were about to come crashing down. He took a step back, his eyes darting to the side as though he could somehow escape the weight of his choices. You don't have to do this, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper, his defiance giving way to fear. We can just let this go, right? No harm done. Jessica's gaze was steady, unwavering as she met his eyes, her voice filled with a calm finality. There's harm done every time someone like you abuses their power. Every time you target people just because you can. That harm doesn't just disappear. Frank's face twisted, desperation clawing at him as he realized the gravity of his situation. Please, there must be something we can work out. I didn't mean for things to go this far. Jessica shook her head slowly, her voice carrying a weight that he couldn't ignore. No, Officer Wallace. You meant every word, every threat. And now, you're finally facing the consequences. He stood there, silent, the fight drained from him, his eyes filled with a haunting realization. Jessica could see the terror in his gaze, the dawning horror as he finally understood that his actions had caught up to him, that the power he'd wielded so carelessly was slipping from his grasp. She took a step back, pulling Chloe closer as she prepared to leave, her voice calm but firm. You should start thinking about your defense, officer. Because by the end of this, you're going to need it. As she walked away, Chloe looked up at her, a question in her innocent eyes. Jessica gave her niece a reassuring smile, her heart lighter, the weight of years of witnessing injustice lifted by the knowledge that, for once, justice would be served. Jessica walked away from Frank, her shoulders squared, each step fueled by the resolve that now coursed through her. Chloe held her hand tightly, sensing the tension still hanging in the air. She looked down at her niece, offering a gentle squeeze, silently reassuring her that everything was okay. But behind her calm exterior, Jessica felt a storm brewing, a mixture of anger, relief, and a deep-seated satisfaction that this long-overdue confrontation had finally happened. But Frank wasn't done. Before she could reach her car, she heard his footsteps, the rapid, desperate cadence of a man who realized just how cornered he truly was. She turned to see him approaching, his face a mixture of anger and panic, as though his own fear were fueling a fire that he couldn't control. Wait, he called out, his voice rough, as though he were barely holding himself together. Jessica's jaw tightened as she turned to face him, standing protectively in front of Chloe. Frank's eyes darted to the child, his expression softening for a moment before he returned his gaze to Jessica, a hint of desperation in his eyes. What do you want, Frank? Jessica's voice was firm, her patience stretched thin. He took a shaky breath, clearly struggling to maintain the confidence he'd worn like armor only moments ago. Look, there's no need for this to go any further, he said, his voice wavering. We can talk this out, settle things here. Just you and me. Jessica's eyes narrowed, her voice steely as she replied, There's nothing to settle, Officer Wallace. What's done is done. It's time you face the consequences. Frank swallowed, his hands trembling as he tried to force a smile, a charm that felt hollow and desperate. "Look, Jessica," he began, dropping her title, his tone softening as he attempted to disarm her. "I was out of line, I'll admit it. But you know how it is, things get heated, words get thrown around. We don't have to make a big deal out of this, right?" Jessica didn't flinch. "Words thrown around? Frank, you didn't just say things. You harassed us, threatened us, and used your position to try to intimidate me and my niece. That's not just words. That's abuse of power, and you know it." Frank's expression darkened, his desperation twisting into something more dangerous, as if he were teetering on the edge of pleading in anger. "You don't understand," he snapped, his voice low. "This job, it's everything I have. You take this away, and I have nothing." Jessica met his gaze, her voice cold but controlled. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you let your hatred guide your actions." His face contorted with a bitterness that bordered on helplessness. "I don't hate you," he muttered, but his tone was defensive, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. People need to know their place. Sometimes that's the only way to keep order." Jessica's gaze didn't waver, her voice dropping to a cold, unyielding tone. "Order? You call what you did today order? Harassing a mother and child in a public park? Stalking us? That's not order, Frank. That's control. And it ends here." He clenched his fists, taking a shaky breath, as if struggling to maintain the facade. "It was a mistake, okay? A bad judgment call. I'll do better. Just, don't take this from me." Jessica let his words hang in the air for a moment, studying the man before her, seeing him stripped of the power he clung to, the authority he had so carelessly abused. For the first time, she could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You made this choice, Frank," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "You made it every time you chose to misuse your badge, to target people instead of protect them. This isn't about one day, one mistake. This is about a pattern that ends today." Frank's face fell, his shoulders slumping as he looked down, the weight of her words settling over him. For a moment, he looked as though he might argue, might lash out. But instead, he took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please. I don't have anything else," he muttered, his tone laced with a desperation that bordered on pathetic. "This badge, this job, it's all I have. If you take that away, I don't know what I'll do." Jessica felt a flicker of pity for the man, a sympathy that she quickly pushed aside, replaced by the resolve that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the people he'd intimidated, the families he'd hurt, and she knew that letting him go unpunished would only perpetuate the cycle. This was his moment to reckon with the choices he'd made, to understand that every action had consequences. "It's too late for that," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with finality. "This isn't just about you anymore. This is about every person you've hurt, every person you've used your power to intimidate. You don't get to walk away from that." Frank's face crumpled, the bravado slipping away as he looked at her, the panic in his eyes clear. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm a police officer. I'm supposed to be the good guy." Jessica's expression softened, but only slightly. "Good guys don't use their authority to hurt others. They don't intimidate mothers and children in public places. You had a choice, Frank. And now you're living with the result of that choice." Frank took a stumbling step backward, his hands shaking as he struggled to process the reality he was facing. He looked down, his gaze unfocused, as if searching for something that could make sense of the situation, something that could save him. But there was nothing. He was alone in the consequences he had brought upon himself. Jessica watched him, her resolve steady, knowing that she had made the right choice. There was no going back, no way to undo the pain he'd caused, but there was justice in holding him accountable, in making sure that his actions would no longer go unchecked. "Goodbye, Frank," she said quietly, her voice a mixture of sadness and strength. "I hope you find a way to live with what you've done." She turned, taking Chloe's hand, and together they walked away, leaving Frank standing alone in the shadows, a man stripped of the power he had once held so tightly. Jessica felt the weight of what had just transpired settling over her as she and Chloe made their way to the car. She kept her expression calm for Chloe's sake, but inside, her mind was a storm of thoughts, emotions running high from the confrontation. She was acutely aware that her actions had set in motion a chain of events that couldn't be undone. Frank's behavior had pushed her to a point of no return, but the consequences, though just, would send shockwaves through the department and the community. She glanced at Chloe, who looked up at her with wide, questioning eyes, as though sensing the significance of what had happened but not fully understanding it. "Aunt Jess, is that man going to be okay?" Chloe asked softly, her voice filled with a childlike innocence that Jessica hadn't realized would affect her so deeply. Jessica took a moment to respond, her voice gentle but firm. "He's going to have to face what he did, Chloe. Sometimes people make choices that hurt others, and when that happens, they have to deal with the consequences." Chloe nodded slowly, though Jessica could tell she was still processing. And in that moment, Jessica felt a flicker of doubt, a lingering question that gnawed at her even as she knew she'd done the right thing. Had she gone too far in taking a stand against Frank, exposing him so completely? Was it possible for him to learn from this, or had she, in effect, destroyed any hope he had of change? As they drove away, Jessica's mind continued to churn. She replayed the confrontation in her head, wondering if there had been another way, a way that didn't strip Frank of everything. She thought back to the desperate look in his eyes, the way he'd pleaded for his job, for the one thing that defined him. But even as she questioned, she couldn't ignore the larger truth: he had abused his authority for far too long, and letting him walk away would have been a disservice to every person he'd wronged. Over the next few days, Jessica tried to focus on her work, on the cases that demanded her attention. But the fallout from the confrontation with Frank seeped into her life, unavoidable and constant. The department had opened an official investigation, and Frank had been placed on leave pending the outcome. News of the incident spread, stirring discussions and debates among her colleagues, and Jessica found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't fully anticipated. One afternoon, as she was wrapping up a case file in her office, she heard a knock on her door. She looked up to see her supervisor, Agent Daniels, standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and approval. Jessica gestured for him to enter, and he closed the door behind him, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Jessica, I wanted to check in with you about the incident with Officer Wallace," he began, his voice careful, as though he were navigating a delicate situation. "The department's investigation is moving forward, and they'll be reaching out to you soon for a formal statement." Jessica nodded, mentally bracing herself. She knew this was coming, but the reality of it made her stomach tighten. "I understand, Agent Daniels. I'll cooperate fully." Daniels leaned forward, his expression softening. "You did the right thing, Jessica. We've all seen Wallace's record, the complaints that were buried, the people who felt silenced. You brought light to something that needed to be addressed." Jessica appreciated his support, but her mind drifted to Frank, to the desperation in his eyes when he'd realized his power was slipping away. I keep wondering if there was another way," she admitted, her voice quiet. "A way to make him understand without completely destroying him." Daniel sighed, a sympathetic look crossing his face. "It's natural to question yourself, especially in situations like this. But Jessica, remember that he made his choices. He chose to abuse his authority, to target people who couldn't defend themselves. You gave him every chance to back down, to walk away, and he didn't take it." Jessica nodded, but the doubt still lingered. She had done what was right, but the path to justice was rarely simple, and the moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on her. As an agent, she was trained to pursue justice, to stand against corruption, but now she was faced with the reality of what that pursuit looked like when it affected someone's life so profoundly. The following week, the internal investigation escalated. Frank had been formally suspended, and he was under review for multiple counts of misconduct based on Jessica's testimony and corroborating complaints from others. The news reached the community, and debates erupted, with some supporting Jessica's decision to expose him and others questioning whether she had overstepped. Conversations at work became tense, with colleagues split over the moral implications of her actions. One evening, as Jessica was heading to her car after a long day, she noticed a figure waiting near the parking lot entrance. She tensed, recognizing Frank immediately. He looked different, his shoulders hunched, his face shadowed with fatigue. But his eyes still held a hint of that anger, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Jessica kept her step steady, her posture calm as she approached him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Frank," she said evenly. "What are you doing here?" Frank didn't respond right away. He seemed to be searching for the right words, his jaw clenching and unclenching as he wrestled with his emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "You ruined me, Jessica. Everything I had, my job, my life, it's all gone because of you." Jessica felt a pang of sympathy, but she held her ground, her voice firm. "You did that to yourself, Frank. You chose to use your power to hurt others, and now you're facing the consequences." Frank's face twisted, his eyes flashing with a bitterness that bordered on resentment. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Standing up for the little guy, making the world a better place. But you don't know what it's like to be me. To feel like you're constantly under attack, like you have to prove yourself every day." Jessica's gaze didn't waver. "Frank, no one forced you to act the way you did. No one made you abuse your authority, to see others as threats. That was your choice, and now you have to live with it." He shook his head, his expression hardening as he looked away, as though unwilling to fully accept the truth of her words. "I was just doing my job. Trying to keep order." Jessica took a steadying breath, choosing her words carefully. "Order doesn't come from fear, Frank. It comes from respect. And you lost that respect the moment you decided to use your badge as a weapon instead of a shield." Her words seemed to hit him, the weight of them sinking in as he looked at her, his face etched with a mixture of anger and regret. For a moment, Jessica saw a flicker of vulnerability, a glimpse of the man beneath the uniform, struggling to come to terms with the reality of his actions. But the vulnerability was short-lived. His face hardened once more, his gaze turning cold. "I hope you're happy with yourself," he muttered, bitterness coating every word. "You got what you wanted. I'm finished. And you'll move on, just like that." Jessica watched him, a sadness creeping into her heart. "This isn't about winning, Frank. It's about accountability. You had a choice, just like everyone else. And now you're facing the consequences." Without another word, Frank turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy, the sound fading into the night. Jessica stood there, watching him go, a strange mix of relief and sorrow settling over her. She knew she'd done what was right, but the moral complexity of the situation weighed on her, a reminder that justice was rarely clear-cut. As the days passed, the department finalized its investigation. Frank was formally dismissed, his badge and title revoked, his record tainted by the charges that Jessica's testimony had brought to light. The community was divided, with some seeing him as a man who had abused his power, while others viewed him as a fallen officer who had lost his way. Jessica tried to move forward, to continue her work with the same dedication and integrity she'd always upheld. But the events had left a mark on her, a deeper understanding of the fragile line between justice and vengeance, between accountability and destruction. She knew that, in exposing Frank, she had upheld her duty to the truth, to justice. But she also understood the pain that truth could bring, the lives it could alter in irreversible ways. In quiet moments, she thought of Frank, wondering if he'd find a way to rebuild his life, to learn from his mistakes. She hoped he would, hoped that the consequences of his actions would lead him to reflection rather than bitterness. She thought of Chloe, the innocence in her eyes, and felt a renewed determination to protect that innocence, to fight for a world where people like Frank couldn't abuse their power unchecked. And as Jessica returned to her work, she carried with her the weight of her choices, the knowledge that justice was complex, often painful, but ultimately necessary. She was reminded that, though the path was difficult, it was a path worth walking, a path that, in the end, would bring light to the darkest corners and justice to those who needed it most. In the weeks that followed, Jessica felt a sense of closure slowly taking hold. The investigation had wrapped up, Frank had faced the consequences of his actions, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of his shadow lift from her life. She continued her work with renewed determination, each day affirming her commitment to justice, to using her own position to protect and uplift rather than intimidate and control. One afternoon, Jessica was at a local coffee shop, taking a rare moment for herself. As she sipped her coffee, she noticed an older woman seated a few tables away, looking at her with a quiet, contemplative expression. The woman hesitated, then got up and approached Jessica's table. "Excuse me," the woman said softly, her voice gentle but laced with emotion. "I just wanted to say, thank you. My son, he had an encounter with Officer Wallace a few years ago. He was never the same after that day. What you did, it's something no one else could have done." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat, humbled by the unexpected gratitude. She offered the woman a kind smile, nodding as the woman continued. "I know it must have been difficult for you, but because of what you did, people like my son can finally feel some peace," the woman said. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder, her eyes brimming with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You did the right thing. And we're all grateful for that." Jessica was moved, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose. She hadn't sought gratitude or validation for her actions, but knowing that they had made a real difference brought her a sense of peace she hadn't anticipated. After the woman left, Jessica sat in silence, reflecting on the journey that had led her here, the decisions she'd made, and the people she had helped along the way. Meanwhile, Frank's life had taken a dramatically different turn. Stripped of his badge, he found himself lost, grappling with the void left by his former life. The job he'd once held as a symbol of his identity was now a reminder of everything he'd taken for granted. Each attempt to find new employment was met with cold rejection, his record, now tarnished, followed him like an unshakable shadow. He tried to blame Jessica, tried to convince himself that she was the one who'd taken everything from him. But in the quiet of his solitude, when there was no one left to project his anger onto, Frank was forced to confront the truth. The encounters, the complaints, the moments when he'd chosen intimidation over compassion, control over respect, it all came back to haunt him. He was finally seeing the man he'd become, stripped of excuses, laid bare in the harsh light of accountability. After weeks of reflection, Frank found himself volunteering at a community center, a place he'd once disregarded as irrelevant to his world. He worked silently, avoiding eye contact, struggling to find meaning in tasks he once thought beneath him. But as the days passed, he found himself listening to the stories of the people there, stories of hardship, resilience, and survival. Slowly, grudgingly, he began to understand a side of life he'd never allowed himself to see. It wasn't a redemption arc he could rush through, nor was it a straightforward path, but for the first time, he was trying to make amends in a way he hadn't considered before. As for Jessica, life carried on, filled with moments of purpose and satisfaction that reminded her why she'd chosen her path. One evening, as she was finishing up her work at the FBI office, she received a letter. It was anonymous, handwritten with care, and as she unfolded it, her heart skipped a beat. The letter read, "You may not know me, but I owe you everything. Your courage helped me reclaim my sense of worth. People like me, people who didn't have a voice, you spoke for us. Thank you for being a light in the darkness." Jessica sat back, a deep sense of fulfillment settling over her. She knew she hadn't taken down a monster or performed some dramatic act of heroism, she'd simply stood up to a man who'd crossed a line too many times. But knowing that her actions had rippled out, touching lives she'd never even met, gave her a profound sense of accomplishment. In the days that followed, Jessica continued her work with unwavering conviction. Her experiences with Frank and the people she'd met along the way reminded her that justice wasn't just about catching criminals or solving cases. It was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, about creating a world where everyone could feel safe, respected, and heard. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones that don't end with simple victories or clear-cut resolutions. Jessica's journey teaches us that real justice often comes with complexity and sacrifice. Standing up for what's right can mean facing difficult moral questions and dealing with consequences that affect others in ways we might not expect. This story challenges us to think about the true meaning of justice and accountability. Can someone who's made terrible choices find a path to redemption, even if they're left with the consequences of their actions? And for those who stand up to injustice, like Jessica, is there ever a way to make peace with the impact of their actions on the people they hold accountable? Let us know what you think in the comments. Should people like Frank get a second chance, even after the damage they've caused? And how far should someone go to stand up against injustice? We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge perspectives, ignite discussions, and explore the many layers of human experience.